Japan is the fourth largest economy in the world. It is a leader in electronic innovation, high-speed train and robots. Yet in the past 2 decades, it has seen an unprecedented decline in real wages. Whilst most economies have been trying to reduce inflation, Japan has been desperately trying to do the opposite, to escape a cycle of deflation which has lasted since the early 1990s. It wasn't always like this for Japan. In the 1980s, the only story in town was a Japanese economic miracle. Between 1960 and 1989, Japan's real GDP increased by nearly 500%. The talk was when it would overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. Yet some of the secrets of its success became part of its own downfall. After the Second World War, Japan was devastated, both economically and psychologically. But it enabled a completely new generation to throw their energy into making the Japanese economy the most dynamic and innovative in the world. Japan seemed to be a decade ahead of everywhere else. Bullet trains, robots and next-generation electronics. In 1979, Sony released the iconic Sony Walkman. For the first time, it enabled music on the move. It was a glimpse into the future, and it flew off the shelves. It was probably a bigger quantum leap than the iPod. In 1989, a list of the top 20 global firms showed an amazing 15 companies coming from Japan. It was the same story in chip manufacture, with a stark contrast between now and the 1980s. But the success of Japanese companies also created an inertia and conservatism which contributed to their downfall. Japanese firms are famous for cultivating a sense of company loyalty and deference to their bosses. But the problem is that this deference created a complacency and inertia. Companies rested on past laurels and lost a willingness to take risks and make radical change. In the US, in Silicon Valley, they were generating new ideas and new products. 2 firms, Apple and Microsoft, now have a market capitalization $1.5 trillion more than the entire 225 firms in Japan's Nikkei index. And it wasn't just the threat from America. Japan was losing its manufacturing advantages to China, the new economic miracle just across the sea. The only country to grow faster than Japan in the 80s was China. But whilst Japan faltered, China took its place. But amidst the euphoria of the 1980s, there was an even darker cloud over the Japanese economy. The miraculous economic growth of the past 40 years had cultivated a sense of overconfidence and invincibility. There was simply a sense Japan was destined to keep growing, and this exuberance saw asset prices rise, which of course encouraged more speculative buying. Like a giant Ponzi scheme, prices rose because they were expected to keep rising. It created one of the world's greatest speculative bubbles. Land values rose 5,000%. Tokyo alone had real estate value equal to the entire United States. A single square metre of a Tokyo shopping precinct changed hands for 32 million yen. There were 20 golf clubs which cost over $1 million to join. The stock market went through the roof. Stocks went from 29% of Japan's GDP in 1980 to 151% by 1989. It's the oldest story in economics, the boom before the bust. And when the Asian crisis hit in the late 1980s, shares and asset prices fell through the floor. The bigger the boom, the bigger the hangover. House prices collapsed, and banks were left nursing huge losses. Falling asset prices caused deflation, and deflation increased the real value of debt, adding a heavy weight to the economy. The unexpected decline in prices changed the psychology of a Japanese consumer, from super confident to super cautious. Households pulled back from spending. When prices are falling, there's always a reason to delay buying. They'll be cheaper in the future. The Japanese economy became increasingly dependent on exports. In the boom years, Japanese firms had hired workers on lifetime contracts, whether they were needed or not. Firms feared a shrinking workforce, but now the problem was whether these lifetime workers could be made more productive. Despite the epic bust, the Japanese boardroom was not geared up to deal with failure. Too big to fail, they had become too conservative and unwieldy to radically change. Far from overtaking the United States, Japan lost ground to China, Germany, and next year are likely to be overtaken by India. Inconceivable 20 years ago. Trying to clear up the biggest asset bubble in history, the Japanese government embarked on fiscal support, trying to stimulate the economy. Government debt soared, becoming the highest in the world, but nothing worked. The legacy of the crash was too devastating. In desperation, the central bank started creating money and buying bonds. It was Japan who invented quantitative easing, but as Europe would later find out, it just doesn't work very well. Japan veered from very low inflation back to deflation. Every few years was a hope of a breakout, but every few years it proved a false dawn. The effects were dire. Japanese wages were basically flat. Only Italy has performed as badly. Now, not everything is a disaster. Japan has still good living standards. Japan has the highest life expectancy in the world at 84.4, much higher than the United States. GDP per capita is reasonable, and unlike many modern economies, Japan has relatively affordable housing. In Japan, planning restrictions are much looser, and as a result, cities have more affordable cheap housing. Also, China's recent troubles are seeing investment start to return to Japan, and it still has many strong exporting firms like Sony and Honda, even if they don't dominate quite like they used to. And in recent months, perhaps most hopefully, there have been signs of finally breaking the cycle of deflation and ultra-low interest rates, although the increase in inflation is due more to cost-push factors than genuinely strong economic growth. But Japan still faces four main obstacles. Firstly, it has a large hangover from decades of stagnation. Government debt is nearly 250% of GDP. It's managed this by the central bank literally creating money and buying over 50% of the outstanding government debt. But as inflation returns, the Bank of Japan have to start unwind its unconventional monetary policy of ultra-low interest rates and buying bonds. And this is a problem because when debt is 240% of GDP, higher interest rates will increase the cost of servicing debt. Interest rate costs are expected to double in the coming years, squeezing government finances at a very difficult time. And this brings us to the next problem for Japan, an ageing population. Now, it is true that fertility rates are falling all around the world, but Japan is like the canary in the coal mine. Its population started falling first, and the working age population has already significantly declined. Unlike Europe and the United States, Japan has virtually no immigration, which can offset the impact of its ageing population. Although the government have made tentative steps to allow short-term migration, this isn't particularly attractive. Very few people speak Japanese, unlike say English, and short-term visas may not be enough. The problem is, with a shrinking working age population, the economy is starting to change. Already schools have been forced to close, and the economy is shifting to the needs of an ageing population. In recent weeks, the Japanese currency and stocks have seen wild swings in its fortunes. In short, this is because Japanese interest rates are ultra low compared to the US. This means there is an incentive to borrow in yen and invest in US bonds, which pay higher yields. This weakened the yen, making Japanese exports automatically more competitive and boosting export revenue. But as the US starts to slow down and looks to cutting interest rates, and as Japan looks to start increasing interest rates, this is going into reverse. The yen is now appreciating, making exporters less profitable, and this is behind the roller coaster of Japanese shares in yen, which was seen in the past and are likely to see in the future. The return to a normal economy will be a very bumpy ride. Japan's crazy economics is an important pathfinder because in many ways it could explain what would happen to China next, because they're experiencing a very similar property bust after a decade of overconfidence and overinvestment. This video explains what is going wrong with China.